about shot put, I think there's a lot of mess around in regards to the variables that actually make the shot go far. So I wanted to make this presentation to talk through first principles of shot put, and from a physics standpoint, what are the variables and KPIs that actually make the shot go far, okay? And really simplifying our approach down to a few factors rather than worrying about a myriad of other things that probably don't matter so much. Now, when we look at shot put in its most raw form, it's just a projectile motion equation, okay? We can calculate the distance of the shot that is thrown based on the release velocity, the angle of release, and the height of release. Now, this in a practical example is if you throw a shot from 2.15 meters at an angle of 38 degrees at a velocity of 14 meters per second, we can put that through the equation and you're going to throw 2185, okay? So the three factors that are going to determine how far you throw the shot is going to be how high you can release it, at what angle you can release it, and at what speed you can release it, okay? These three factors is going to determine what the throw is. However, your release height is going to largely be fixed. Depending on how tall you are, how long your arms are, things like that, there's going to be a set height that works for you, okay? I can release at 2.15 based on my height. If I jump through the roof to try and get that up to 2.3, I'm probably going to take away from some other factors like release velocity, okay? For angle of release, that's kind of fixed as well. Based on projectile motion, there's an optimal angle of release that will result in the longest distance thrown. In theory, this is going to be around 45 degrees, okay? But in actual fact, in real scenarios, it's much closer to 38. This is just due to the makeup of your body, and we think about this from a lifting standpoint, your bench press is going to be much stronger than your overhead press, okay? The size of the muscles, the muscle fibers, you can produce more force horizontally than vertically. So you can produce more release velocity if that angle comes down from 45 to 38, okay? So again, this factor is also relatively fixed. So if these two variables are kind of fixed based on your own body and anthropometry, the real determining factor of how far you will throw is maximum release velocity. Now, there's some really good data that you can get out here. This is the biomechanical data from the 2017 London World Champs. There's also a good report on the 2018 World Indoors. There's some earlier ones, one of Berlin 2009, but there's not as much data in that report. And I just want to go through here and look at the different strategies that different throwers have to achieve release velocities and how they differ. So we already discussed that release velocity is the prime indicator of throwing distance. And here we can see the correlation. So distance thrown by each competitor in this left column here, and the release velocity for each competitor here. And you can see going from green to red in terms of biggest to smallest, it roughly follows a similar pattern. There are a few outliers here and there, like Conrad down here, Stipe up here, another one, but we can see they share a correlation of 0.78. In terms of correlations, 0.1 is the best correlation you can get. That means it's pretty much the same thing, okay? So 78 is pretty good, yeah? Now, they have a shared variance of 61%. So what this means is the release velocity is explaining 61% of this throwing distance. Yep. So that means there's 39% that's unexplained. That's going to come down to how much energy you can put in the shot. So things like the height and angle of the release, whether you're leaning forwards, backwards, falling away, side to side, things like that. But 61% of your throwing distance can be directly attributed to how fast that shot's leaving your hand upon release. Now, it's not just shot velocity on release that matters so much potentially, but there's also shot velocity through other phases, okay? We're not just doing stand throws, so there's a whole other section of the throw that we have to consider. So here are some velocities. First one is at double support number 2, which is power position, 2 feet on the ground at the front of the circle. Single support 2, which is when you've turned and your right foot, if you're right-handed, has come off the ground and you're pushing over the top of your left foot. And zero support, where both feet have left the ground and you're just about to release the shot. So what we can see is if we go through, we've already discussed that velocity release has a pretty strong correlation to throwing distance, but the further you get away, the weaker it gets. Yeah, and we can see in the color charts, it's kind of a mess trying to pick out who is the best thrower based on distance. when we compare it to release velocity. It's a little bit messy. So I don't think it really helps you to compare one thrower to another. We can't use that data over here and look at single support and say this person won, because it's not correlated. However, it can be really good at determining an individual's throwing strategy or variation from one throw to the next for the same person. So when we look at all these people here, we see a distinct strategy of acceleration. So from double support to single support to zero support to release, we see a consistent acceleration of the shot through all those phases. Now, where that gets interesting is we look at the case of Ryan Whiting here and the difference between him throwing in London in 2017 and in Birmingham in 2018. We see kind of two separate strategies or different variations of velocity changes. So his acceleration profile at London 2017 looked a bit like this. Double support, 2.1 meters per second. Single support, zero support release. Throwing 20.66. The interesting factor here is there's a deceleration entering zero support. So as both feet are leaving the ground, he's starting to push. That shot has actually decelerated about 1 meter per second. Okay. Now that most likely down to falling away from the shot. I think if we go back, we can see Ryan White here, forward back lean at release, minus 14 degrees and minus 12 degrees of trunk lane. So he's falling back and to the left. So he's not getting his energy into the shot, which is why it's decelerated, okay? It accelerates again as he punches it out, but this deceleration limits how fast he can get upon release, which is why he's only thrown 20.66. Vice versa, at 2018, a slightly different strategy where he enters double support slightly slower, probably a bit more conservative. Single support, again, a little bit slower, but he's accelerating as normal. And he's potentially much more direct through the circle. This way, he continues his acceleration. Okay, he goes from 13.23 to 13.51. He actually increases his speed versus in London, he decreased it. And it results in a higher release velocity and 40 centimeters worth of distance change. Okay, so monitoring velocity through these phases can be quite powerful to actually determine throwing distance within the same person when technical strategies are largely fixed. So we know that different individuals have different strategies. We want to look at how they end up getting the end velocity, 14 meters per second or thereabouts for 22-meter throws. So we can see across the board from time of double support, so brace leg touchdown, left leg touching at the front of the circle to the time of their release, look at this change in acceleration. So going from anywhere between kind of 0.5 to almost 3 meters per second entering double support phase to 14 meters per second shot leaving the hand. It's an increase of 818%. That is ridiculous. Okay, we can see throughout the phase, shot velocity is pretty consistent at under 3 meters per second until you get 2 feet on the ground. Then there's a rapid acceleration until the end. Okay. Now the phase duration from your left leg touching down, entering double support, 2 shot exiting the hand, again, varies a little bit, but we're looking at around 200 milliseconds and below. Okay, so an increase of 818% in only 200 milliseconds, okay, which is phenomenal. Okay, that's an extreme amount of power. How much power? Well, let's find out. Okay, if we assume that the shot enters double support at 2 meters per second, which is about kind of average for that selection, and release velocity at 13.85 meters per second, which will mean a throw of around high 21s. This is an increase, 11.85 in 183 milliseconds, which was the average duration of double support phase. Pop that through to calculate power, we get this number here. 3,723 watts of power is what happens from double support to release in a 22-meter throw, essentially. Okay, so simple form, if we strip away all other assumptions or variables or bias about what makes a shot go far, the simple answer is you need to produce 3,724 watts of power in your double support phase, and you'll throw 22 meters, okay? Now, how you do this is more complex and open-ended, and there's probably many answers to that question. But the simple fact is you either are achieving this amount of watts and throwing far, or you're not, okay? You're not going to be able to throw far without producing that. That's just simple physics. But where there is room for, I guess, an open-ended answer is the how you go about this. So technical models are completely various. You know, you watch world champs of the Olympics and everyone looks different, okay? They end up achieving a similar power as we just went through, but the way they go about it is going to be so different depending on each person. Okay, we know this. So technical model is going to vary greatly. When you really break down technique, as far as I can tell, there's two distinct throwing strategies that occur. Either momentum-driven strategies or impulse-driven strategies, or more traditionally thinking of like a speed thrower or a strength thrower. Okay? So you're either momentum-based or you're impulse-based. Now, your momentum-based throwers, at the moment, you're going to look at your European rotators. You're going to look at your Italian, so Fabry, Weir, Thomas Stanek is another example. Your Kiwis, Tom Walsh, Jacko Gill are both going to be momentum-driven throwers. And your impulse-driven is going to be your Americans largely, and people from an American model. Krauser, Kovacs, Darrell Hill, Peyton Ottedall, people of that nature are going to be more impulse-driven. So our momentum-driven guys, they're going to start quickly and they're going to try not to lose speed and not decelerate throughout the throw. As a result, they're going to enter their double support phase at a higher speed. They're going to spend less time in double support. And this is going to be beneficial for them because they're weaker concentrically and they don't have the same output. So they're going to have smaller stand throws. They're probably going to have smaller max strength levels. That means in order to reach the required watts, they're going to have to do so by starting fast and keeping that momentum up. And we can see that if we go all the way back to velocities here, we can see Tom as an example of this, where he enters double support, and Thomas Stanek, I mentioned, is another example. They enter their double support phase faster than anyone else does. Look at Tom, Jacko, all entering double support at the fastest velocities, okay? Because they're using this momentum-driven strategy. Impulse-driven, they're going to have a much more conservative, controlled entry, and you're going to think a lot about resisting that left arm opening up. They're going to try and enter a big wrap into their double support phase, and they're really going to decelerate the momentum of that shot. They're going to spend a much longer time in double support. And these guys, for the most, are going to have larger stand throws, probably more traditionally strong. Okay, so this is very much an American model. And if we go back again, we can see the evidence of that, where we look at Krauser, Darrell Hill, Joe Kovacs. These guys have the slowest speeds of the shot in their double support phase. Look at Darrell Hill, the shot almost stops. Yeah, because they're entering that big wrap and hold. They spend the longest amount of time, so 220 for Darrell Hill, Krauser at 220, Kovacs at 220, versus those elastic guys like Tom and Jacko, they're under 200 milliseconds. Okay, so the American strategy, this impulse strategy, is to wrap, hold, have 2 feet on the as long as possible, and just turn it into a stand throw. Yeah, and when these guys can stand throw over 20 meters, it doesn't take much for the shot to go that much further. Okay, versus these guys who are momentum driven, who don't have the tank, who can maybe only stand throw kind of 15 to 17 meters, they have to get the system moving a little bit quicker and get a little bit more speed out of the system to get the same results, okay? Now, one's not necessarily better than the other. They're just different, and you should understand that if you are one or the other, you can succeed that way, okay? If you are weaker and quicker, you don't have to turn yourself into a big, strong beast to throw far, okay? There's other strategies out there. This is the velocity profile, momentum in the blue, impulse in the red. Difference being essentially when we get to the double support phase, there's just a much quicker uptake of velocity for the impulse driven, okay? They're coming in slower and they're exiting at the same speed. So that uptake it's much steeper for impulse versus momentum. Obviously, there's still a large increase, but they try and kind of maintain it throughout the movement. Now, the question does kind of remain a little bit, again, if one is better than the other. Now, we can have an example of this, of a momentum-driven thrower throwing an impulse related strategy. If we look at Tom Walsh from around 2013, okay, we can see him throwing with a more impulse driven strategy. And he's said this before, looking at a traditional kind of technique from an American lens where there is a low flight time through the middle of the circle, getting 2 feet on the ground and impulse driving that shot. Okay? And we can see this in his biomechanical data here. So he's spending 200 milliseconds from 2 feet on the ground to release, as opposed to when he won the World Championships, it was 170 milliseconds and around 180 milliseconds when he won in 2018. Okay? So he's gotten much faster since he moved to a momentum-driven strategy. Now, the problem with Tom here, and because this is long ago as well, he definitely wasn't as strong as he is now, he didn't have the concentric force production abilities to produce that steep impulse to accelerate the shot to a high speed. So he's only throwing 19 to 20 meters at this time. Release velocity is probably around 13.4. But let's say he's entering that double support phase. Instead of at almost 3 meters per second as he was in 2017, he's maybe entering at 1.5 meters per second, okay? He doesn't have the strength to accelerate from 1.5 to 14. So by the time it comes to release, he ends up at 13.4 and only throws 20 meters. Versus now, riding the momentum, he enters faster, which means he exits faster as well. So one, not necessarily better than the other, but know what works for you and chase that strategy. Don't force yourself to go down another path. Now, we went through the correlations and we understood that release velocity and the speed of which you release will account for 61%. Now, the 39% of your throwing performance is down to how much you can get into the shot. So an example from the World Champs data is Conrad essentially releasing the shot at the same velocity as Tom, a little bit less, but around the same velocity, but throwing 1.3 meters less, okay? So it's probably fair enough to deduce that Conrad doesn't get his energy into the shot to the same extent that Tom does. Yep. So when it comes to translating that shot power into shot distance, what's going to matter is you're in the middle of this Venn diagram where you can produce a lot of power and you get it all into the shot, as opposed to producing a lot of power, but it's not going anywhere, or getting everything you've got into the shot, but you've got nothing. Okay? Now, from a chart standpoint, it looks a bit like this. If you're in this top right quadrant, you're going to be an elite shot putter where you can produce a high amount of power and transfer every last bit of it into the shot. As opposed to maybe when you were a beginner and just starting out, you couldn't produce any power and you couldn't get any of it into the shot. Okay? Then there's this intermediate section where either you can't produce power or you can, but you can't transfer it and you're going to throw okay. Yep. But you need a combination of both if you're going to end up in this top right and be an elite thrower. So if you're watching this, you might be wondering why I'm on here talking all this shit when I can't throw that far myself. If it's this easy to understand, why can't I do it? Okay? And I understand that. And I just want to share potentially what I think my own limitations are in why I'm not in this elite club. I might self-report and put myself maybe around here. But I think I'm not following these constraints well enough to throw far. Okay? So my PB, 1905, which if you, again, take the correlation we've done, it's going to mean I have a slower release velocity. I don't have the same biomechanics data behind it, but I'm going to assume it's somewhere in the range of 12 to 12 and a half. Okay? So I can't accelerate the shot to 14 meters per second, so I can't throw 22 meters. Now, the why behind why I can't accelerate the shot, in my opinion, it comes down to energy leaks and not being efficient enough upon the double support phase. So if we look at this video here, you see my left foot come down and it comes down very heavy. You see that heel drop. Yep. So if you do the math, so you can do this with your own throw. If you film a throw, see what frame rate the video is taken at. Most videos are going to be 30 frames per second. Some are going to be 60. If you count the frames, 2 feet on the ground to release, and then divide it by the frame rate, you'll get your phase duration. Okay? So I'm spending 220 milliseconds in my final phase from double support to release, which is what we determined around an impulse-related strategy, like an American model. The difference is, like we went through that Tom example, I'm not strong enough or powerful enough. I've got a 15-meter stand throw. I can't throw an impulse-related strategy. Okay, so this is too slow for me. If I potentially want to throw 21, 22 meters, I'm going to have to spend 180 milliseconds in that final phase. Yeah. Now, that's not going to happen as long as this left heel dumps down, because I'm already probably spending 100 milliseconds eccentrically dumping before I can concentrically produce. So I'm just not going to be able to ever do it. Yeah. I'm going to need to be able to hold that left side strong and not land heavy to continue the acceleration of the shot, to have a quicker amortization to accelerate that shot to 14 meters per second. So from a technique standpoint, we've just covered over everything that's going to generate enough velocity to throw 22 meters. Now, physically, there's going to be some tools that you need to throw that far, okay? You can't just take Joe Blow off the street, give him a really good technique, and assume that he'll throw far, okay? There's going to be some physical qualities required. Now, if we look at the shot put action and what's going to generate this power, essentially, there's going to be avoiding eccentric yielding and blocking out key positions, and continue to accelerate to produce a concentric force at the end of the throw. So this left heel is a perfect example of why I'm not throwing as far as Joe Kovacs. If you watch my left heel, bang, dumps, lose energy, shot decelerates, throw 19 meters. Or bang, no deceleration, shot continues to accelerate, 22 meters. Okay? Simple, right? Much harder in practice, but the theory is simple. You have to be strong enough to not yield under that eccentric load and that ground contact in order to continue to accelerate the shot concentrically upon release. That's what physical tools you need. Now, it's not just as simple as getting as strong as possible. Yeah, we've already gone through that these things happen in such a short time frame and such rapid amounts of power that traditional lifting, if it's just like powerlifting style, get as strong as possible, that's going to be far too slow to actually influence these factors, okay? And there's semi-evidence of this if you read any of Dr. Bondarchuk's books or any of the data he's collected in terms of exercise correlations to shot put form. You can see, if we look at the squat example or bench press example, if you're a beginner to an intermediate to a decent level shot putter, traditional lifting correlates to a decent degree, okay? Squat success will indicate shot put success to a relative degree of accuracy at moderate throwing distances, yep? But as you get to this top end distance, okay, it doesn't. There's no way to tell, yep? So there's a drop-off point, there's a point of diminishing returns for traditional concentric performance on shot put success. Now, to make this point even greater, a thought experiment. If you take 5 shot putters, 5 mystery throwers in front of you, knowing that there's one guy who throws 22, one who throws 21, one who throws 20, an 18-meter thrower and a 16-meter thrower, okay? They're all in front of you, but you don't know who is who. And you had to come up with some tests that they could perform that you would then be able to rank them and guess who was the best thrower based on these tests, okay? So if this was the case, what test would you come up with where you would be able to find the best throwers and the worst throwers, okay? Now, the easy answer is you make them throw shot put, okay? That is the pinnacle. If you made these guys throw shot put, you're going to get a clear indication of who's the best and who's the worst shot putter, right? That part is simple. So if we know that's the goal, what are our other check marks below that? What about traditional lifting? If you made them do a 1 rep max bench press, could you confidently say the order of their throwing performance? Not a chance. Yep, not a chance. There's every chance that the 16-meter thrower has a bigger bench press than the 22-meter thrower. Okay, go to any powerlifting club and you'll see ridiculous bench presses, but they're not throwing shot far. So that's not going to tell us anything. What about how far they throw an 8-kilo shot? Yep, big time. That's going to tell us pretty much everything. Similar as the shot put example I said first, that's going to give you the perfect order, 1 through 5, most likely. Maybe some variation of the top couple, but that's going to tell you a hell of a lot. And the last one is, what about bar velocity on a light or a medium loaded snatch. Okay? Maybe. That's not going to probably give you the same perfect correlation as the 8 kilo shot, but it's going to get you a hell of a lot closer than a 1 rep max bench press. So when we think about it from this frame, it's really helpful to say what exercises or types of movements, classification of movements will correlate to shot put success. So if we know that it's going to be the quicker things, the more powerful things like throwing a shot put or moderate weight bar velocities that are going to translate to throwing distance, that sheds light on where our most effective training is. Now, if you want to give yourself the best chance to be as powerful as possible, remember we have to produce around 3,700 watts to throw 22 meters. You need to be as powerful as possible to do that. Yep. To know that, we've got to know what power is and how we can go about training for power. One more physics tangent. I promise this is the last one, but we want to break down what power is, okay? So we look at power. It's just the work done over the time it takes you to do that work. Now, work is simply force times the distance. We keep breaking that through all the way down till we get to our end power equation, which is this on the top right. Power being equal to the mass, we've got change in velocity, displacement, and time. Now, if we look at this equation based on what's on the top, where our numerators and our denominators are, mass, change in velocity, and displacement are all directly proportional to power. Meaning, if you double one of these variables without changing any other variables, power will also double. It's a one-to-one relationship. Everything stays the same, but you double mass, you will double power. Now, the fun part about this is this little fella up here, this little square, okay? Now, that makes time inversely proportional to power, in the sense that because of that square, if you half the amount of time it takes you to do this, everything else being constant, you'll actually increase power by a factor of 4. So the time that it takes is a much more significant variable to our power equation than anything else. In practice, what this might look like is if we lift a really heavy weight, so we think about increasing mass in this equation, what's going to happen in practice is that will decrease movement velocity because it's a heavier weight, you can't move it as quick. That makes sense. So mass will increase, velocity will decrease, and because velocity decreases, time actually increases. So power reduces because we've increased time and decreased velocity, which overrides essentially the increase in mass. So power is down. So that's not powerful. If we lift a lightweight, mass goes down, yeah, but it increases velocity and decreases time. So power actually increases. But if we lift a heavy weight, but we shrink the range of motion, right? So instead of thinking like a full squat, if we go to a quarter squat, mass increases, velocity will decrease, because you've got less range to accelerate it. So velocity goes down, but time also goes down because you have less distance to travel. So power greatly increases here, okay? So if you really want to efficiently and effectively train power, you have to increase either the velocity of the movement or the mass of the movement whilst time decreases. Okay, you're going to have to do 2 out of those 3. You can't just increase mass because it'll mess with the other 2 variables. You can't just increase the velocity most likely because it'll mess with the other variables. But we've got to try and do a bit of both. Practical example number 2. If we look at a few different exercises and how they may affect power output, a full range squat, 300 kilos. Who wouldn't want that? Most traditionalists would love to have a full range 300 kilo squat, okay? And they'll say that's going to make you throw far. But will it? Probably not. If you're doing 300 kilos, it's near maximal effort. You're probably moving it around 0.3 meters per second, and it might take you 2 seconds to do, okay, if you're truly maxing it out. If we take a jump squat, load it up to 100 kilos, but you can move it quicker and it takes less time. Or a quarter squat, so if we squat to a high box at a heavy weight and it doesn't take us as long because you don't have to move it as far, okay? You can just bounce up and down on top of that box. Doesn't take too long. What's the power output? Here we go. 880 watts for a full range squat, 1373 for a jump squat, 1570 for a quarter squat. So if our shot put goal is 3,700 watts, what exercises are going to get us closer to that goal. Yep. We can already see that we're moving in the right direction here. Now, this doesn't mean that you should never squat heavy and slow. There's probably going to be room for that in maybe in like a general preparation cycle, thinking that that will increase your potential to produce power in, say, a quarter squat if your traditional lifts are stronger. But you just have to know that that's at such a low correlation to shot put that you can't really draw that line. Versus you can get more confident in drawing that line with increased success at these training methods. So if you get strong, great, but there's going to be a level that's sufficient to help you build maximal power. If you just take the time that it takes to accelerate an object and reduce it by either increasing the velocity or by decreasing that time, you will improve power. Any more focus on just getting strong, and you're just going to condition your body to grind efforts and move slowly, which we don't want, okay? Again, this may be more beneficial for an impulse-related thrower who's just trying to add size, add mass, add strength, but this is never going to work for a momentum thrower, I promise you. So, in summary, shot put performance is simply about who can produce the most power in the shortest period of time and transfer it all to the shot put. Okay, that's going to be the key factor that determines who comes first, who comes second, who comes third, and who's staying at home. Now, the technical strategy to go about producing this power is going to vary from person to person based on their own individual factors. So depending on how tall you are, how big you are, how fast you are, how strong you are, these things are going to determine what strategy you should use to chase this performance. The third part is if you want to become powerful, train for power. Okay, don't just try and get stronger. Don't think that numbers in a bench press is going to mean numbers in a shot put. They're not the same. And the last bit that I'll leave you with, if you can take one thing, is don't copy what you see online, okay? Even if you see what Joe Kovacs or Ryan Krauser does, that works for them based on their strategy of reaching these metrics. Yep, it might not work for you. You might be having to use a different strategy. Decide and figure out what metrics are going to correlate with your own success and do what you specifically need to do to improve these metrics. Now, what I mean by that is if you figure out that you are a momentum-based thrower, if you suit a style more like a Zane Weir, like a Tom, then you better not be chasing raw max strength numbers like you're a Joe Kovacs, because those two things don't marry up, okay? Figure out what's going to work for you and train your ass off down that pathway to achieve those key metrics that are going to result in your shot put success, okay? I want to follow this up at a later date if anyone's interested. If you enjoyed this presentation, I'll make another presentation on more specific training methods about how you go about chasing either strategy in a practical setting. So if you're interested about that, maybe leave a comment, let me know, and I'll make that.